The Columbian Exchange. The conduction of this exchange occurred because of the economic advantages that the land could provide as determined by the Europeans. The Europeans thought that bringing their resources from home could make an even better opportunity to create and gain money. They thought that with the labor of the Indians they wouldn't have to do much and could make this money easily. Once they had the newly introduced crops in their hands and a vast amount of other cultivated resources, the Europeans knew that they could transport it back home and have more money for it. Columbus was the one who started this exchange because of the followers he gained after his voyage. Others began traveling on their own, bringing all of the materials, animals, and crops between both the New and the Old World, thus creating the Columbian Exchange. The human environment throughout this course in history was balanced because the Europeans were able to adapt to the New World, and the Native Americans were also able to adapt to the nature of the new crops being produced, since they always depended on natural resources. In exchange, this led to the increase in the population in the New World at some point during the early years of the Columbian Exchange. However, when the Indians were put to work in harsh conditions and for large periods of time, the death rates increased. That's when the environment really negatively affected the human environment.
Physical environment. The New World had great fertile land, which allowed them to produce crops and even more natural resources than they had before. The fertile lands allowed Europeans to make an extra profit, not only for themselves, but for the country they came from. The amount of fertile land showed Europeans that their workers, which were the Native Americans, could use more help in order to plant and collect as many crops as they could. Noticing that they could get help, the Europeans got slaves from Africa transported in order to do the jobs of the Native Americans, especially since the population of the Native Americans was decreasing.
As aforementioned, land in the New World was fertile, and during the exchange of crops, the Europeans cut down trees and any other natural source in the way to cultivate their crops. As new crops and new animals were brought, the lands would be wiped out for the animals to graze. For example, the trees in the forests would be demolished. Native settling places would be moved elsewhere because of the Europeans' needs. These new animals led to soil erosion because of the land being farmed and eaten by the animals. This may have been a helpful tactic to maintain the New World with crops and profit the Europeans economically. However, this damaged the physical environment. Erosion was becoming an issue because of the constant cultivation of crops, and not only that, but deforestation was also becoming an issue in the environment because of the Europeans' desire to build their structures and settle in the New World.
Effects. Triangle trade, labor force, and natural resources. Needing a new labor force after the European disease smallpox and violence killed off about 90% of the natives, slaves from Africa continued to be transported into the New World. African slaves were cheap, which allowed the Europeans to get hundreds at a time. African slaves, instead of the remaining natives, continued to collect and produce natural materials like sugar, cotton, gold, potatoes, and silver. Triangle trade. The importance of manufactured goods. In order for Europe to make a greater profit and the most of their resources, many of them were traded for horses with Europe. Europe then used these resources to create products like rum and molasses. These manufactured goods paid for more slaves to be sent to the New World. With the New World having more workers and more crops, the cycle then continued.
There weren't only environmental changes in the New World. In fact, there were biological and cultural changes as well. With the presence of the Europeans, the Indians learned new forms of living and doing things. For example, the Europeans, Spanish, brought their religion along with them and also wanted to convert the natives into Christianity. Another idea they brought forth is the idea of unity, since the Europeans would side with one another. Meanwhile, the natives really lacked the sense of unity, as they would capture their own people. And throughout wartime, the natives learned that the tactics used by the Europeans were successful, as they would capture instead of killing their opponents.